Congressman Khanna, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you back here on the show, and congrats on the book. The pandemic created a window of opportunity for wealth distribution, new digital jobs that can go anywhere. Where do you imagine the new tech hubs of the future will be, and how do we make sure the money follows?
Well, Emily, you're absolutely right. That the pandemic was a forced experiment in remote work, and these companies figured out that not everything had to be near Sand Hill Road, that they could invest across the heartland and in the South. In fact, one venture capitalist who criticized my book said, well, we're already doing everything. So it has gone from being seen as impossible to inevitable. But when I think of an ideal example, I think of Intel in Ohio, putting $20 billion in, creating 3,000 manufacturing jobs, 7,000 construction jobs. I talked to Pat, the Intel CEO, a couple of days ago. He said there's so much enthusiasm there, nationalism there, aspiration for the future. That's what we need to do around the country.
I just spoke to Pat, and he mentioned that conversation. Your book is called Dignity in a Digital Age. When you look at the biggest tech companies out there, do you see a dearth of dignity, and what's most troubling to you?
I think there's an insufficient concern for dignity and human agency online. What is most troubling to me is people having surveillance on everything we do, everything we think about or type in online, and then these companies getting that data. I cite Tim Cook's commencement speech at Stanford, where he said to be human means that we need some zone of privacy, some place where we can't just be manipulated with information about us. And that's why I worked with Tim Berners-Lee on an Internet Bill of Rights, so that you would have to opt in to give your data, and we couldn't just have companies taking this data from us. That, to me, would help be a first step in preserving our dignity online.
You're calling for mutual responsibility between Congress and the tech industry, tech CEOs, in the innovation economy. What specifically do you want to see from Mark Zuckerberg, Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, Andy Jassy, even Tim Cook?
Well, I want to see two things. On the economic front, I want them to be imaginative about how they can recruit and retain more talent from rural America, from HBCUs and Hispanic-serving institutions, make more investments across the country, as Pat at Intel is doing. I mean, he grew up in Pennsylvania. He really believes that he has a responsibility to build American manufacturing and is excited about that. I'd like all of the tech CEOs to imagine how they create opportunity in places that have been left out. In terms of the public sphere, that's a much harder question because yes, we need regulation on data, on consumer protection, on making sure that there's competition, but the government can't be the arbiter of truth. And so these companies, particularly the social media companies, have a responsibility to make sure that the speech that they're encouraging is inclusive, that they are being thoughtful in creating a space for people to exchange ideas, and they aren't just defaulting to sensationalism that captures attention but isn't really conducive to good public discourse.
What about Section 230 that's protected tech companies like Facebook or Meta for so long? Should Section 230 be repealed?
It should be reformed. I talk about things that need to be reformed in it. First, if you have an incitement to violence, which means that you don't pass the Brandenburg test, you shouldn't have that speech on these platforms. Right now, believe it or not, you could have speech that incites violence and it's still fine to have it on the platform. There's no liability. That needs to change. There should be rules that if you're actually inciting illegal conduct, that speech shouldn't be on. And then I think that Section 230 probably shouldn't apply as much to the algorithmic amplifications or to bots online as opposed to the human speech. And that's something that the nuance has to be worked out.
Looking at Meta, we're following Meta's earnings results today, their pivot to the Metaverse. And I wonder if this move concerns you, that hate, misinformation, violent contacts will only be amplified in virtual and augmented reality.
Well, I think it's inevitable that companies are going to go to the metaverse and that our experience is going to be not just online, but it's going to be three-dimensional and then it's going to be integrated. But the challenge is that we need then even more urgently to have rules and regulations so that you don't have all of the problems on social media become even more amplified, where this becomes part of our reality, walking to the coffee shop and we're being bombarded with messages targeting us and our vulnerabilities. And that's why I think we need to have restrictions on data. We need to have consumer product standards. If a social media product is causing teenage depression or suicide, it needs to be regulated. And if we have those regulations, I think it would apply to the metaverse as well.
Big tech companies say that breaking them up will only make it harder for users to use services that they love, and that helps small businesses. What's your response to that?
I think there has to be a balance. I am not for just breaking up all big tech. There are absolutely efficiencies of scale. There are products that help consumers and that actually help small businesses advertise. On the other hand, when you have companies that are acquiring competitors to kill competition, that shouldn't be allowed. And when you have companies that are privileging their own products and not allowing other vendors or sellers onto their platform without any good reason, that shouldn't be allowed. And so what I've proposed is a balancing test saying you shouldn't be able to discriminate against sellers unless you can show it's clearly in the consumer welfare. I sort of strike a middle ground between the break them all up school of thought or the let them just be school of thought and have a balanced, well-crafted regulatory approach.
Now, we're in the midst of one of the deepest partisan divides in modern history, but tech seems to be a place where Republicans and Democrats are finding common ground. That said, the devil's in the details. When and where will there be consensus specifically?
Emily, there's been consensus on the Innovation Competition Act, so we're going to see the largest investment in technology since the Kennedy days, and that's going to be distributed around the country, and it will have the CHIPS Act, which is going to have semiconductor manufacturing. I was very proud to work with Senator Schumer on that, and Congressman Mike Gallagher, Senator Todd Young. That's bipartisan. When it comes to privacy and antitrust, that has been harder, and frankly, we haven't done well enough. We ought to come to some consensus, at least on basic principles of privacy, making sure that people know what's happening to their data, that companies have a fiduciary duty to treat data responsibly, that you have to opt in to consent. And on antitrust, I think we're making progress. But again, I don't think you can have just a break up these companies philosophy or restrictions that don't take consumer welfare into account. If we can tweak some of the language to have that balancing test, then I think that can pass as well.
Do you feel an urgency to get something passed, something more passed on tech regulation ahead of the midterms because Democrats might lose control of the House?
Yes, Emily. I mean, I'm going to be straight. The president's party often doesn't do well in midterms, and we only have a 3-seat majority in the House. Do I hope we win? Absolutely. But we can't take the chance if things don't go our way. So we have a 1-year window to get something done, because I don't think a Republican House is going to do anything. And it would be absolutely problematic if we don't pass legislation, especially as we look to 2024 and the role that disinformation could play in disrupting our democracy.
Now, we're seeing huge tech M&A already this year, Microsoft and Activision, a big one. How is Congress watching these big deals, and what questions are they raising?
So I believe that Senator Klobuchar's legislation here makes a lot of sense, and it's something I endorse in the book, which is to say, if you have a deal, an acquisition that is over $5 billion, then the presumption is that that may not be competitive, and it's on you to show that it actually is competitive, that it helps consumers, and that it's not going to suppress other competition from emerging. And if you can show that, then you should be able to proceed. That we have to still pass that into law. I hope we can pass it into law so that these big mergers are appropriately reviewed, not automatically struck down, but approved only if they're truly in the consumer interest.
What about the China factor? Big U.S. tech companies say we're at risk of giving technological leadership to China. Are you worried about that? Well,
first of all, China's got a lot of problems these days. I mean, the real estate market there has collapsed. No one knows where Jack Ma is. I don't believe state-owned enterprises are really going to lead the 21st century in technology innovation. That's never happened in human history. And so I have confidence in our companies to outcompete China. And I think we can do that with our values. We believe in this country in privacy. We believe in human rights. We believe in dignity. And I think we can succeed without compromising those fundamental values.
The next wave of big tech innovation seems to be cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. Are you excited or terrified? And what do you think the right path is for legislation?
I'm more excited than terrified, and I think there has to be well-crafted regulation to prevent fraud. But let me just explain simply what some of the benefits could be. You could have a college textbook that costs 20 to 30 bucks now with an NFT be accessible to many, many college students at a fraction of the cost, and the author still making money from writing that book. You could have transmission to other parts of the world with less middleman fees. You could have smart contracts that are able to be executed without having many transaction costs. So there's actual utility in the technology, but what we need to make sure is that people aren't engaged in scams to get people to invest. And so obviously there has to be regulation, but we shouldn't discount how important blockchain may be to the future of innovation.
Many folks we talk to seem to think that blockchain could be the secret to diluting the power of centralized platforms like Facebook and Google. Could the blockchain, do you see this as a way to restore dignity to the digital age?
It's a tall order, but I will say that the blockchain is fundamentally decentralizing, that it, by definition, doesn't require a centralized company or centralized actors. And if more people get tokens and more people have ownership, then there are possibilities of them building wealth. And then there are possibilities of them building interesting applications. And so I am bullish on that aspect. Now, I reject kind of this idea that they're going to replace currency. I mean, the United States is 51% of the reserves, and all of cryptocurrencies are less than 1%. And there's still a lot of faith in the dollar. Ultimately, the cryptocurrencies get transferred into dollars. So I'm not of the view that somehow this is going to replace the dollar or be an alternative system. I do think the decentralizing technology, though, gives us new ways of organizing the economy in ways that are exciting.